topic of today. We are very proud today to present you a very distinguished panel of speakers who have all contributed over a long process in the first big publication of our office. The Rosa-Luxemburg Foundation has been active in international affairs and supporting global social movements and trade unions since 2003, but our Geneva office is quite new. It was only opened in 2019, and we're very proud that this book that we discuss now, this If Not Us Who, I have it here also in the German edition, is actually our first big product, and we're very happy because the key topics of it, the role of trade unions, labor unions in the fight against authoritarianism in history, in different local contexts, is a very important entry point for us. And I think it's a very current topic as well, looking that we are living in a world with so many different authoritarian challenges, an attack on social rights, an attack on workers' rights, an attack of democracy in the periphery as well as the centers of our global economic system. So this book is available for physical purchase, but it's also available as a free PDF download in German and English. But it is most of all a very significant contribution to a debate that we on the left and progressive globally should have, how to strengthen the international trade unions, labor in the struggle for authoritarian. I think if I can sum it up, that the book clearly shows that labor and trade unions are a necessary prerequisite for democratic and social transition. They are not enough. So there always needs to be an ecosystem of social movements, political parties, society actors, but without them, I think we could say most attempts have failed. So they are a necessary prerequisite for social justice and transition. And we are looking today at different case studies. For this, obviously, we have to welcome the editor, which is Dario. He's going to speak to us in a second, but I'm very honored also to introduce today's speaker. That is Anna Calori, who is the research fellow at the Global European Studies Institute in Leipzig. Her current postdoctoral analysis looks at the Yugoslavia economic cooperation with the Global South. She has worked in the NGO sector in the Western Balkans and at the ILO in Geneva. A very warm welcome to you. Dario himself is a professor for development studies at a university in Mexico and visiting scholar at Cornell University in the US. At the moment, he has conducted research into social transformation processes for more than 25 years. Domingo Perez is a sociologist with a master in social science and a PhD in geography. He's a researcher in labor strikes observatory at the Center for Social Conflict and Cohesion Studies in Chile, if I get it correctly. And we have Jeremy Morris, who's a professor of global studies at the Art Aarhus University. And last not least, I would like to welcome Nicole Urich, who's a labor historian based in the Eastern Cape of the Republic of South Africa at the Department of History at the University of Fort Hare, and her researches on organization and political ideas of workers in Southern Africa in their location in global traditions of radicalism. Very warm welcome to all of you. We are very looking forward to your inputs. There will be a Q&A. Technical questions for participants, please write them in the chat. They will be responded. And with this, I would like to hand over to Dario.
Hello, everybody, and welcome. Thank you very much to Jan Leidecker, and my thanks obviously also to the Rosa-Luxemburg Foundation who made it possible to do this I think, very timely and very important book. And also thank you to all the authors that participated. It was, I think, a great experience, a great process, and I think we have a really great and important product we have here available, and it's also great that it's available for free download and globally in German and English, and we hope that there might be more translations to other languages. So what was like the initial idea? What pushed us to do this book? I mean, we had discussions with the Rosa-Luxemburg Foundation and others, and we look at a field where, like, a part of the left over the past decades insisted in, well, labor is gone, work is no identifying, no cohesion, cohesion category anymore. It's all about identities. Nothing is about labor, work, or like proletarians or working class. This disappeared. The future belongs to identities. On the other side, we had like this I would say old-fashioned left that said, well, identities don't matter. We're all workers and working class. It's the only thing that matters. And first of all, like I think that work and labor still matters. It is still a category that people identify with because it's what they do, what they do for their surviving, what they have to do. And also, if they don't work, they identify still at working class communities. And we can also see that it is not even, I think, it doesn't make sense, and it's not possible to separate between like identities, certain identities, or like identities that are part of the hierarchization in capitalism. So gender, race, migration, ethnical origin, attributed ethnical origin, or whatever, have been and have always been categories that have been used in capitalism to hierarchize, to assign certain functions, to assign certain roles, to assign a certain position, etc. So it's not about negating neither one nor the other. It's about understanding how these elements are interrelated and they matter. And if we look at the struggles, and is what we do in this book, like globally, from Argentina, Chile, Colombia, Brazil, to the US, South Africa, Tunisia, Egypt, Portugal, the former African colonies of Portugal and their effect on the Portuguese Revolution, South Korea, Japan, India, Indonesia, Philippines, Iran, Israel, Lebanon, Iraq, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Russia, Spain, United Kingdom, France, the GDR, and Federal Republic of Germany, then we can notice one thing, that the struggles come from the margins. So it's the new struggles come from the margins. Historical subjects have been in all these processes of struggles against authoritarianism, dictatorship, etc. There's an important study that was like made looking at the more than 140 social transformations over the past 100 years, and it concluded that in more than 50%, it was like a central. The industrial workers were central. If now we broaden this category of workers and don't look just as at industrial workers, but also other workers, and we also understand that, like, given the changes in the productive structure, but also in the composition of the working class, then we can see that that's why, like, the feminist movements of the past years, be it in Latin America or in Spain, in Italy, etc., have been basically also working class women's movements. We have seen uprisings like in Chile or in Bolivia or in other countries where we can say, or in Lebanon or in other places where we can say this have been working class uprisings. Black Lives Matter was our Black-led working class uprising. So we see that this working class still matters, but it's strongly interrelated with these other elements that hierarchize capitalism and the new struggle. So if we look like in a traditional way, like some labor studies students do, and then they see, okay, and they notice, well, there have been less strikes than ever over the past 2 years. Well, yes, if you take the statistics of the US Labor Office, which counts as strikes only, as worker struggles, only strikes that have been called out officially by a union in a workplace with more than 1,000 workers, then yes, because these workplaces also don't even exist anymore in the same amount in the global north as they did like in the 70s. So the working class struggles in the global north have moved, like the productive structure has changed. So the services, small shops, small factories, there are walkouts, there are like different ways to struggle. We see, like, the other thing is like to look also at the global south, which has been like neglected by, let's see, the industrial relations mainstream. So the idea of the book was like to collect all these examples, historical and contemporary examples, to point out and say, look, working class matters, and it doesn't only matter as an identification for people, but it also matters, like Jan said, for social transformation. But it's not your white male Northern Hemisphere working class that you know from Fordist literature. It is different. It has always been much more diverse in any sense, but it is today more than ever. So this is what we want to look at in this book, and want to point out this and bring like different debates, like of a broader understanding of what work is, of what classes, of how struggles can be structured, etc., and to learn from these different places. I want to stress again that it's been a wonderful experience, because obviously people, struggles, and dynamics in different countries, different places, use different concepts, different terminology, different approaches. And it was very interesting and I think fruitful how it worked to listen to each other, to look at it, and to be able to read these different experiences, even if they don't express maybe in the same terms and logics like others would do it. So I am again very thankful for this possibility to edit the book, and thanks again to all the authors and the ones that are here for having participated in this, I think, great work. So I would like now give the floor to Nicole so that she can speak about her chapter, or starting from her chapter, or whatever you've prepared to contribute. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm just going to share my screen quickly. I hope everyone can see it. Great. Okay. Also, just to say thank you very much. My name is Nicole Urich, and as the introduction said, I'm from South Africa. Thank you very much, Dario, for putting such a fantastic book together, and also for the Rosa-Luxemburg-Stiftung and the translators, and so I'm probably going to pronounce it wrong, sorry, Seve and his team, and also for all those who came to listen. Okay, the title of my chapter in the book is The Wheel is Turning, Fighting Apartheid with Workers' Democracy, 1950 to 1990. In the preface of the book, Dario questions the association that's been made recently between workers' politics and authoritarianism. And he reminds us that organized workers, especially industrial workers, have historically been crucial to democratization of states and societies. My chapter celebrates this rich historical global tradition of worker-led anti-fascism, and also of workers' struggles for democracy, equality, and human dignity. But at the end, I'll also be drawing a few lessons for the present. Okay, South Africa has a very long and complicated history of labor organization, but we're going to focus on what I'll call the progressive trade unions that opposed apartheid. And apartheid, very briefly, was an authoritarian system of governance based on racial separation and oppression that allowed for the super exploitation of Black, but especially African workers. So, there we go. The South African Congress of Trade Union, you can see their badge over there, led the organized workers against apartheid in the 1950s. By the time this federation was formed in 1955, communism had been banned, and the industrial relations system had been brought in line with apartheid policy and law. The registration of racially mixed unions was prohibited. African unions were never illegal, but they were given no legal status, and African workers were arrested and charged criminally for being involved in strikes. One of the most significant features of SACTU was that it promoted the idea that bread and butter issues were fundamentally political in nature. The Federation argued that the struggle against apartheid and for national liberation was a key part of trade unionism. And the Trade Union Federation formally aligned with the African National Congress, the ANC, and the Border Congress movement. However, SACTU's political unionism was implemented very unevenly and with mixed results. It was a tremendous success in the region known as KwaZulu-Natal, where a number of small factory committees, these were very conscious small groups that would go into factories and organize in secretly to set up worker committees, which would form these new model unions. And in this particular region, we see democracy actually giving this workers' movement quite a lot of strength, to the extent, sort of historians argue that in this region, workers are setting the political agenda of the African National Congress. But this is not true for the whole of the federation. And many of SACTU affiliates actually struggled with this particular political unionism. Many, for instance, did not set up democratic structures, and they either failed to address the political issues of workers, focusing on the economy and wages and that type of thing, or they totally forgot about wages and organizing workers at the factory floor and were dominated by the African National Congress and other Congress structures. The 1960s are generally seen as a decade of darkness and as a period of intense repression in South Africa. Open political resistance was brutally crushed, and organizations such as the African National Congress, the ANC, and the Pan-African Congress were banned, forced underground or into exile. SACTU was never banned, and the ANC decided to use the Trade Union Federation as a front to recruit for Umkhonto we Sizwe, which is the armed wing of the ANC. And within this particular context of repression, you can imagine trade unionists were arrested in large numbers. And by 1963, SACTU had basically was no longer operating, didn't have any local structures. And most of its leaders had gone into exile. So it's really up until the 1970s with the 1974 strike wave that we see workers again start pressing back against apartheid and authoritarianism. And the strike wave, which started in the port city of Durban, spread across the country from 1973 to 1974 and involved up to 90,000 workers. The strikes marked the reemergence of the workers' movement, the progressive workers' movement, but would also, I think, fundamentally change the political landscape forever. The new unions were not just a revival of the old. Firstly, they would be considerably bigger. At its height, SACTU, for instance, organized as a federation, organized only 50,000 workers. And secondly, they would also set in very different kind of ways to address the organizational weaknesses of the trade unions that had preceded them. And one sort of response to this was to develop new modes of incredibly resilient and democratic organizations. So let me get to the next slide. You'll see that the badges of the different federations look very similar. So in 1979, a number of unions that had emerged after these strikes came together to form a new federation called the Federation of South African Trade Unions, FASATU. By 1984, the federation claimed a membership of 120,000 workers. FASATU promoted non-racialism, which I think is a very important counter to apartheid, industrial unionism, and tight worker structures that pooled resources and developed joint policies at a national level. But one of the most distinctive features of FASATU was the creation of this worker control tradition, which was the development of democratic structures that were rooted fundamentally in the workplace, the point of production, where workers are strongest. And it's here that workers were elected and then mandated into further structures of the union, and the federation attempted to create structures and resources to ensure that these workers' leaders would dominate decision-making at every level. So I think it's important to note that these non-racial organizations that were opposed to racial separation and that were run democratically and led by African workers stood in direct opposition to the authoritarian and racist assumptions of the apartheid state. It is here that we see the emergence of the idea that the union movement was building tomorrow today. And that's basically means if you want a democratic society, you need to start developing and building your own structures from the bottom up. So this focus of democracy shapes Fossatu's position on the political role of movements in important ways. First, Fossatu looked to its African neighbors and saw that the new nationalist movements that had sort of led independence in Africa were turning on trade unions and turning on workers. And so a lot of people were quite skeptical of forming alliances even with the progressive nationalists, because they believed that once independence or democracy would have been obtained, then the workers would be sold out and it would just be about the elites getting richer. Secondly, Fossatu criticized SACTU, the previous federation in the 1950s, for subordinating unions to political parties. And Fossatu argued that workers could only gain meaningful control over society if they created their own democratic and independent structures. Another point of important difference was that the characterization of the apartheid state, where SACTU previously had said you cannot actually engage with the apartheid state because they're fascists, and the only result would either be repression or co-optation. Fossatu said, they're drawing on Gramsci, said, well, actually, we are going to try and exploit loopholes and trying to exploit any reforms made for our own advantage to try and push reforms further than they are. But they made the important point that this would only be possible if unions were strong, democratic, and resisted co-optation. Okay, so then we move to 1985, which is COSATU, which is the largest trade union federation in South Africa today, formed in 1985 with about 500,000 members. The really interesting thing about COSATU, I think, is firstly, that it comes from this tradition of fighting apartheid, and it tries to reconcile these two different traditions, the one of the political unions of SACTU from the 1950s with this strong democratic trade union tradition for SACTU and workers' control from the 1970s and 80s. But what we see is very early on, COSATU adopts principles of democratic trade unions united by this tight national federation with vibrant educational and cultural structures. But the emphasis on political independence of trade unions, an integral part of this whole notion of democracy, falls away. It does not endure. And I think that raises questions about sort of the fragility of this particular approach, that why was democracy, this really profoundly and deep sense of direct democracy, so fragile? And COSATU formally aligns with the ANC and the South African Communist Party, the SACP, which it's still in alliance with today. And the second part, and this relates back to what Dario was saying, is that, and I think it's very important to understand the significance of the broader anti-apartheid movement and the really important role that COSATU played, is that trade unionists did not just remain in the workplace. Trade unionists who had learned about democracy and learned about struggle in the workplace went beyond the workplace and were key to the development of sort of community-based structures, very democratic, based on block committees, as well as community resistance. COSATU, formerly as a federation, also supported defiance campaigns, stayaways, public marches, and all sorts of rallies against apartheid, and united not just only with the ANC, but also formed linked with organizations such as the UDF, the United Democratic Front, and the Mass Democratic Movement. So between 1950 and 1990, the trade union movement was key to defeating the racist authoritarianism of apartheid. But this was done through militant action and also through building strong democratic trade union structures, and also for forging a collective imagination of egalitarianism and non-racism. But since 1994, democracy has brought new challenges. As warned by the unionists in COSATU, the political alliance established by COSATU have not protected workers in post-apartheid South Africa. The ruling ANC has embraced a neoliberal program and is paying scant attention to COSATU's policies, suggestions, and programs. The massacre of 44 workers at Marikana in August 2012 has also revealed the brutally pro-capitalist character of the new democratic state. and has caused fractures within the trade union movement. And for me, I suppose one of the biggest dangers and one of the biggest lessons that I think we need to think about is that since apartheid has ended, democracy, what we mean by democracy, has become very rigid and small. It's mainly associated with electoral politics, with sort of a liberal democracy centered on parties, politicians, and parliament. The drastic narrowing of our political imagination has led to a perceived separation between politics and the economy. And workers' organizations have been reduced to bit players. They were really huge in the 1980s, but now their bit players were sort of restricted to the realm of negotiating about wages and working conditions. And I sort of do fear that this sort of narrowing of our understanding of democracy and of direct democracy and participatory democracy, and reducing the role of trade unions to providing voters every 5 years, has created space for the emergence of quite a pseudo-left populist authoritarian politics that is centered on a few charismatic leaders in South Africa today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nicole. There's a question for you in the chat, but I'm gonna first we do all the presentations and then we have a question and answer session. So I would pass on now to Jeremy Morris. He's back. He was gone, had to leave for a bit, but he's back on time. Thank you, Jeremy.
No problem at all. So I will share my screen and I'll try and do that. Just give me a second. And if you can tell me whether you can see my presentation, that would be great. Can everybody see that? Yep. Okay. So, and now can you see the full slides, I hope? Yep. So this is a short piece about the very significant developments in Russia and around labor activism, trade unionism in Russia over the last 20 or so years. So Russia has a very long authoritarian history, particularly in relation to workers' rights, as I'm sure you probably all know. So in the USSR, under rapid industrialization under Stalin, most workers experienced extremely coercive and exploitative conditions. At the same time, there was the development of a significant welfare state, and unions, as many scholarly studies have demonstrated, unions in the workplace were given a key role in redistribution and what is commonly called a paternalist social contract dominated. Workers gave up associational power under actually existing socialism, under the Soviet system, in return for an unspoken commitment to increasing wages and social benefits. And so a term that scholars of the working class and unionism in Russia today still use is this term, the social wage, because benefits over and above a quite small cash wage were so important. And in some degrees, the memory of this kind of benefit remains important to many workers. So the social wage included things like access to housing, access to kindergartens, and even subsidized work canteens, cafeterias. So the Soviet system broke down, large-scale strikes were observed in the transition period, at the beginning of the 90s, and then also at the end of the 1990s. And workers in Russia really demonstrated their quite effective capacity to express their structural power. Independent unions began to form, not only in extraction, in mining, but also in transport and automotive. And I'll be talking about the automotive industries in a minute. But really, these independent unions were quite small, represented a small number of workers. In the slide in front of you, you can see what we have today, which is it calls itself the Independent Russian Trade Union Federation. But in reality, this is a relatively meek and mild organization. In fact, it's still the largest federation of working unions in Europe, with probably less than 20 million now. The point being that this federation almost never initiates strikes or confrontational protests, despite a background of growing worker and working class militancy in Russia. This, is, you can really see from this photograph, is a bureaucratic organization that rejects class conflict. And its track record in voicing work demands is low. In fact, the woman giving a presentation here is one of the leading politicians in Russia. Also noteworthy is a low level of solidarity between sectors in Russia. There's not really a history of coordination between unions and political parties, except in a corporate sense. And there are trilateral agreements, but they are really purely to serve the interests of the ruling elite. Since the early 2000s, we can observe a significantly increasingly repressive labor code backed by a resurgent security apparatus that can sometimes be used to target individual union organizers. And that's something I personally witnessed in my own research. At the same time, as I've already kind of indicated, even this repressive atmosphere cannot completely extinguish protest and resistance on the part of labor, okay? Particularly using things like micro-tactics, such as work to rule or picketing, or using the internet. Union activists are really improving their visibility on the national stage there now. And this is particularly true in key sectors like automotive and service industries, okay? Especially because those kind of areas are less dominated by these traditional unions. So my case study focuses on automotive in a Volkswagen, the German car maker, in a Volkswagen plant in Kaluga region. So next slide. Foreign firms in particular are also a fertile area, especially during the first decade of the 2000s. New unions quickly took the chance to kind of colonize potential spaces, such as Volkswagen, Ford, and new unions started to address workers' rights and interests in transnational companies, such as Volkswagen. Here you can see the logo of the MPRA, which translates as Interregional Trade Union Workers Association, which is small, but plays an outsized role in Russian labor militancy. Based on their experience in St. Petersburg, in the Ford plant, they were able to leverage the strong workplace bargaining that workers have in the automobile industry. I've studied, as I said, Kaluga region, just southwest of Moscow, where there is a big industrial zone and benefits from being close to Moscow, but also having a lot of very low paid yet qualified workers in the area around, which allows Volkswagen to pay relatively low wages, even by international comparisons, right? So in the late 2000s, the assembly workers in Kaluga were paid less than equivalent workers in Brazil. And so there you have a picture of the 600,000th Volkswagen Tiguan that was coming off the production line there. So this independent union, MPRA, was very quickly targeted by the independent and more activist trade union. 4 years after that, by 2012, 1,200 workers were organized. The union had got recognition. It had been a local success. And a lot of that was thanks to informal and formal actions. So balloting for strike action, but also things like work to rule. Also informal picketing of other enterprises, such as car dealerships, telling potential customers that they were buying cars that at a plant that was exploiting workers, and even sabotaging production. Of course, MPRA could not be seen to be condoning that, but certainly that took place as a result of the radicalization of workers at these plants. They just have a slide focusing on that. And very unusually, for the Russian context, as I've said, you have a success story of Volkswagen, this powerful transnational company, being forced into recognizing and signing a collective bargaining agreement with this relatively small union, okay? So that's just to summarize the main points of our case study that my co-author, Sarah Hintz, and I have authored. You can always go to my academic website and read all the papers about it. Sarah tells me I have very little time left, so I'll just conclude. What can we learn from this? There are new, in the last 10 to 15 years, new conflict-orientated unions appear, and this is promising because Russia is a highly authoritarian, highly hostile to labor state. New unions have a track record of successfully representing workers and challenging the legacy system. Yeah? They do this through grassroots organizing in some respects traditional ways, but also using the internet. Again, something that I could talk a lot more about if I had more time. On the other hand, the prospects for lasting consolidation are not great for some of the reasons that I've talked about here. There's been a stagnation in developing associational power. Structural power remains strong, and we can see this through the number of informal strikes. But associational power is relatively stagnating. Unions focus on local actions. However, just the last three bullet points there, ironically, it's the authoritarian state that in some respects provokes further development. because of its extreme, I call it neoliberal authoritarianism and austerity policies, worker radicalization has spread to the public sector. And in fact, in the last 4 years, we've seen far more grassroots labor organization among workers such as doctors. So how can activists regain the initiative? In a piece that I've just recently written and which will be published in a book this year, I basically illustrate a transition in how activists move from car production, from the automotive industry, to new service sectors like the Russian equivalent of Uber, that is Yandex in Russia, and the Russian equivalents of food delivery companies, which are dominated by extreme exploitation, low wages, and migrant labor from Central Asia. This is a trend that we observe at the moment, the partially successful mobilization in those areas. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. Before we pass on to Anna and Domingo, our last two presenters, we wanted to insert a small question and answer section about the first two presentations. So if you have any questions, you can send them to the chat. We have already question here. Before that, I want to remind again, I want to say hello also to some more authors that are listening here to the presentation. We couldn't invite everyone, but to everyone listening to us, we have this immense variety of authors, and it includes also a variety of languages. So wherever you are, you could also always organize a discussion, a presentation, something. And I'm sure that there will be authors ready to participate in, so I think, and I don't have to be part of it, nor does it have to be necessarily the Rosa-Luxemburg Foundation. I mean, if you want to present the book or organize a discussion somewhere virtual one, you're very welcome to do that. That's the idea also behind the book, to get into a conversation all over. Okay. Thank you very much once again. The example, I'm thankful for Jeremy's example about how they organized workers' resistance in the car factories, because this would be a strong example for the kind of worker struggle that would not fit into the logic of, let's say, mainstream industrial relations research. It wouldn't appear in any statistic because it was not the union. It was not that officially called for it, because obviously they couldn't. But it's also not a strike if they do the picketing or the other elements. But these have been, throughout the history of the working class, also elements of worker struggles. And even if during Fordist times, when we had these huge factories and a correspondent model of society, the strike was the most visible element of worker struggle. It doesn't mean that it was the only one. And we are now and we see even in Russia, these methods or struggles and organization and unions are expanding to the service sector. But that's the issue. So if we want to see what's going on, we have also to look at it differently than mainstream industrial relations does. So thank you again. Okay, there's one question in the chat that came up for Nicole, which is, there was also a white workers' movement in South Africa. How did the existing white union federations act towards Black and non-racial labor federations?
Okay, so thank you for that question. You actually, it's very interesting because firstly, South African labor history is very complicated, but very little has been written about South African labor history. And at the moment, there's a little bit of a debate because the focus has tended to be on COSATU, which was so powerful, this huge, big, powerful organization. And also it's linked to the ANC. We've had this national liberation struggle, and we tend to focus on the national liberation history of the African National Congress. So there has been quite a lot of attention paid to that. I'm at the moment trying to start tracing the history of what the second largest trade union federation in South Africa, which was started out as a white trade union federation for white-collared workers and mainly men, which underwent a significant transition in the 1980s, dropped its racial policies, dropped its gender policies, and still remained incredibly moderate, but non-racial. And as we move closer to democracy, they sort of started working a lot closer with COSATU. I think were influenced a lot by COSATU, but they remain quite moderate, and in some instances, still a little bit social democratic, but sometimes also quite pro-labor, pro-business. So there's that particular almost moderate middle in the sense. Then on the other hand, you also have this very long history of workers, white workers organizing separately along racial lines, very particularly with the idea of keeping Black workers down and of protecting the color bar. And basically that's job reservation on racial grounds. And that tendency, obviously in the 1970s, it really starts to go into crisis as we not only see the move towards democracy, but we're also seeing and significant economic transition taking place. And basically the apartheid elite, the white elite, is abandoning the white working class and turning their back on the white working class. So they actually go through quite a lot of crisis where their privileged positions are basically now under threat, and sort of all the job perks that they used to have are also being undermined. So they go through quite a lot of crisis in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. But they've proven to be quite resilient and sort of reformulated themselves and do exist in some form. More of a social movement, perhaps more of a conservative social movement, which does still organize white workers as well as colored workers. And colored by, I mean, particularly by a particular group in South Africa, designated colored under apartheid. But they're called Solidarity. So that current still exists in a sense, although it's fundamentally rebranded and looking at multiculturalism and protection of minority rights. So I'm not sure if that really answers your question. I think that really what we also need to understand is that when that sort of conservative racist movement is quite clearly conservative and racist. And I think what we also need to pay attention to is sort of other movements starting to emerge, which are sort of wearing a cloak of being progressive, but are anti sort of immigrant and promoting immigrant violence and things like that. And I think those are also sort of the kind of threats and those traces, and also looking at other conservative type of trade unions, such as in the 1980s, UMWASA, I'm forgetting the full name, where you had played a very conservative role and spreading a lot of violence against workers in the trade union movement. And they were sort of Zulu nationalists and considered very conservative and problematic. So yeah, I hope that answers the question.
Thank you very much. So Jeremy, there's one question for you. To be brief, we will have a few minutes also at the end again, please. So what is the basis of solidarity among workers of Uber platform economy in Russia that helps them articulate their resentments? Is there a similar solidarity among workers in Denmark or Europe, or how does it work?
Well, yeah, I would emphasize how much in common struggles among these precarious workers have in common in the West, in inverted commas, and in an authoritarian state like Russia. These people are obviously very visible, and the vast majority, perhaps 60, 70, 80%, are immigrants in some way, right? So they are visible to the host population, and they are also visible to each other, which in some ways makes organizing them easier. Certainly, this has been the case in Russia. Of course, what I emphasize in my own work is contingency, the things that are difficult to predict, which is the dedicatedness of activists who migrate from other causes, particularly the Russian socialist movement. So almost exclusively, for better and for worse, these kind of campaigns are successful or unsuccessful based on the commitment of migrating activists from other causes. So ironically, as Russia gets more authoritarian, the political space is emptied of activism because it is illegal to be politically activist. That has pushed some political activists into the sphere of labor organization. They are still subject to extreme police measures. And the guy that I work with closely, he's been arrested multiple times merely for representing workers. So it's not a good news story, but it is a story of kind of displaced political activism.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. If we have more questions here, I want to just put one foot out for Nicole, but really very, very brief in your response, and then we have another one later for you. This one would be Marikana massacre. Has anyone been held responsible, and who?
No, I don't think anybody's been held responsible, but probably the person who could really answer that question is the person who asked me the next question, is Dale McKinley from Right to Know and also from Ulrich, who's been, I think, quite centrally involved in such campaigns. But as far as I know, there's been a few NGOs, there was a large commission, and no one's really gone to jail or anything that I know of. There might have been some reparations paid, but if I recall, those were not as much as expected or have not really been properly distributed. So it does give us, okay. And then
we have this up here so we don't take away time from the other presenters, but at the end, you will all have the chance again to say something. There's another question then from Dale. You can respond in the last round, and we'll also ask Dale to maybe post a brief response to the question who was held responsible. But I would now hand over to Anna Kalori, please.
Thank you, Dario, and thanks to everyone for coming, and to Rosa-Luxemburg colleagues for organizing this. So I will now just briefly share my screen. It's just a picture, so hopefully you can hear me and see it as well. Okay. Can you still see it, or can you see the document now? Okay. So I need to first introduce myself. I'm a historian of labor. I'm a researcher at the University of Vienna. So I moved since we published the paper. And I work at the Research Center for the History of Transformations, where we focus specifically on the historical and social economic transformations that we see happening in Eastern Europe, but also at the global level in the period between the 1980s and the present day. Why should we talk about the former socialist world and Eastern Europe and Bosnia in particular? Dario mentioned at the beginning that one of the things that basically started his idea for the book was precisely questioning this idea that labor is ended, this narrative, historical narrative that after 1989 we see this kind of end of labor, the death of worker states, particularly as socialist regimes crumbled in the in formerly Eastern Europe, and as a consequence, the death of workers' movement and working class identity. In the article, I also try and question this narrative, and broadly in my research, I focus on the former socialist countries, and specifically on this period of transition, or so-called transition to a market economy, precisely because this was the moment that laid the foundation of the neoliberal European order as we know it. And I examined this crucial shift from the perspective of those who lived through this transformation in first person as protagonists, so workers. I collected a lot of oral history interviews with trade unionists, workers, people in social movements, etc. And I report just a few in the chapter for this book. And for this article, and I did something that actually is only apparently unusual for historians. So I started not at the beginning, but rather at the end, with the picture that you see here, that depicts actually some of the unrest that happens in Bosnia in 2014. It was in February of that year when we actually see the largest protests, not only in the country, but in the region since the dissolution of former Yugoslavia. And these protests saw thousands of Bosnians taken to the streets to protest against wild corruption and privatization. So I examined, starting from the end, going backwards, what actually did lead people to this rupture point. I will just stop sharing now and just introduce the article. So here I actually try and trace the long-term history of these transformations and the role that workers' movements played in it. Dario mentioned at the beginning identity. And I think here is very important to look at the different ramifications of working class identity, and the historical narratives and the memory associated to it, and how they play into mobilization in recent years. So to have a kind of a historical picture of where Bosnia came from and went into in relation to its workers' movement. So this was a country that was heavily and rapidly industrialized under the first decade of the socialist regime. We see coal mines, refineries, large power plants, aluminum production, etc., and construction that were growing industries that punctuated the Bosnian landscape. And since the famous or infamous split with Comecon and with Stalin in 1948, we know that Yugoslavia tried to build a kind of a third way, its own path towards socialism, organizing a system of self-management, which basically meant that workers were coordinating and managing their own factories. And crucially, for the perspective of what we will be talking in a minute about privatization, there was a form of ownership under the socialist regime that was termed social ownership. So workers were essentially considered owners of their own factories. And this will become important in a second. So thanks to the push towards rapid industrialization, which was paralleled by the ideological tenets of a socialist society, labor played an increasingly crucial role in socialist Yugoslavia. And this further established a strong tie between workers and their factories and workplaces. And indeed, ownership here also strengthened this sense of connection between workers and their factories. So with fast and increasing industrialization came, however, a progressively unmanageable size of international debt, which brings Yugoslavia in the 1980s to a period of deep and ultimately incurable political, social, and economic crisis. So the country starts to crumble towards the end of the 1980s. We also see the fall of Berlin Wall in 1989, major transformations happening in the whole region. And as Yugoslavia crumbles, so does Bosnia. And I'm sure all of you who are familiar with the recent history will know at least a little bit about the conflict that shook the country between 1992 and 1995. And from the perspective of what we're interested in today, so the question of workers, we see here that as workers were co-opted into different paramilitary factions that were fighting each other, obviously the population becomes divided, but also spaces and factories and industrial sites become a point of contention between different warring factories. And as a consequence, they become internally fragmented and disputed in terms of their own, of who they belong to. And so it's already, actually even before the end of the conflict, that the problem of who do these factories belong to and how can they be privatized arises. So Bosnia comes out of the conflict divided into different entities with different parliaments, political administrations, institutions, and so forth. The international community, in its attempt at actually acting as a guarantor of the Dayton Peace Accords, promotes neoliberal reforms that are meant to bring Bosnia somewhat at the same level of quote unquote development and modernization as the other former socialist countries. And at this point, we see here a series of mass privatization and liberalization reforms that happen across the country that are supported and only rarely opposed by the local leadership. And we see here that the supposed transition to democracy and market was mentioned also before in the context of Russia. We can say that Bosnia today is somewhat locked in a form of pluralized authoritarianism, a system where we see a few nationalist parties that control each and every aspect of the political, economic, and social life of the country. This is obviously at the detriment of the larger population, and specifically of workers who, until the large mass privatization of the 90s and the 2000s, were still technically owners of their own factories. So just to briefly and slowly move towards a close, in the article, I bring different and several records and testimonies of these workers and trade unionists who tried to oppose this large reform program, which actually revealed itself as a process of accumulation by dispossession on the side of local elites, with the connivance of international institutions and organs. These transformations brought to actually incalculable loss of rights and resources, especially in the form of ownership rights for workers. This kind of enormous devastation that added to the destruction caused by the war of the 1990s actually tore apart the social tissue of Bosnia, and this is what led to the protests of 2014. In these protests, we actually can see a renewed movement, which is, if possible, multi-ethnic and multi-generational, precisely because it tries to actually recreate new alliances based on class solidarities. During the months that followed this, the February 2014 uprising, we see workers and social movement activists actually spontaneously organizing into new forms of collective gathering and decision-making called plenums. These plenums gathered regularly in different cities and became a space of democracy from below, a kind of an attempt to recreate some of the dynamics of self-management that people were familiar with. And this was a great opportunity actually for a divided nation to rekindle around cross-ethnic divisions and beyond them. So numerous initiatives came out at the time, such as, for example, workers' universities and several attempts at reclaiming and re-owning factories. A few of them were actually successful for a time. So we see a strong role of bottom-up independent unions that actually sprang out also in response to what they saw as a connivance of the official trade unions, seen as partnering up with some of the nationalist parties in carrying out, or actually not opposing strongly enough, the privatization reforms. And the protest actually translated into an important, although temporary, shift towards more social democratic political consensus at the national and local elections. But overall, the economic situation remains only very mildly transformed. However, and here I will conclude, I don't think that we should cynically evaluate protests just by measuring their effects on political environment immediately. The former Yugoslavia is a place of only apparent immutability, of only apparent dormant societies. We're seeing these days large protests in Serbia against the environmental destruction that is being carried out at the hands of the current government in partnership with large transnational mining companies. And these are just another manifestation of the renewed democratic participation in the region that also started thanks to the Bosnian protests in 2014. So I think that's all from me. And thanks, I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Anna. Before we pass now to Domingo for the last presentation, just briefly, last week I did with Anna and another author a presentation and a discussion of the book in Italian. So you see there are like a lot of possibilities to invite authors in different contexts and do discussions about the subject. A brief response by Dale to the question about Marikana. He says the only unsuccessful criminal prosecution that has taken place involved one of the police generals at that time, Lieutenant General Mpembe. The police commissioner at that time, Ria Piega, was subsequently dismissed from her post. The Farlam Commission on Inquiry concluded that several police leaders should be held accountable, but no legal cases have since been launched. Most of the recommendations for reform of police conduct and training, etc., have not been implemented. Okay, thank you for that, Dale. We're going to go to your question after the presentation of Domingo. And Domingo, listo?
Hi. Oh, listo. Bueno, se ve el cambio de imágenes, ¿cierto?
Okay, can you see my presentation? I would like to join congratulating all the team organizing this meeting. It is amazing to have this link between all these authors around the world. It's fantastic to gather point of view. Okay, my presentation is called Anti-Neoliberal Revolt and General Strike. I did it with my colleague, who is also who is a PhD student. History of Chile. In 1970, for the first time in world history, we chose a socialist government developing big reforms, which took power after a military coup. The military coup established neoliberalism in '89. There were protests in the 80s, general strikes that changed the political regime. But in 1990, and this is where we place our study, Chile begins a period with three main features. Chile is a country with huge wealth, but also enormous social inequality in Latin America. We have a very high GDP, very high inequality. Secondly, in these years, there is a working class that becomes more and more precarious. There's job insecurity. I mean, sometimes so high that the workforce had a 50% of job insecurity. I mean, 50% of the workforce had a high job insecurity. Same problem with social-specific poverty. In the main regions of the country, 50% of the workforce was poor. They were working poor. But something that was very striking in Chile is that the new democratic governments begin to develop neoliberalism in spite of job insecurity, precarious employment, and all the poverty in the working class. There is a very strong political stability. There were no voices against the government. Now, if you look at our geography, if you look at our map, the map of our country, it is very difficult to organize mobilizations and strong links between movements and forces, because the country is very long and it's difficult to establish connections due to our very specific geography. In this context, when we come to 2019, more and more social mobilizations begin, with a lot of industrial actions taking place. There is enormous job insecurity, poverty, but in 2019, in October, there is the biggest outbreak and popular revolt ever in our history takes place. Big in number of people, but also the mobilization lasted months and months. Now, what were the exact events? The high school students started to protest in October 2019 in subway stations. And the state responded with a lot of repression and violence. So this prompted a lot of solidarity with these student movements. And also the government officials, who were very comfortable in their power position, began insulting the citizens. And so in October 2019, a lot of subway stations are burnt. Now, we still don't know which workers, students, who burnt these subway stations. It is still being discussed, actually. And we call it a social outbreak because it was very, very fastly transmitted from cities, but then very quickly to the suburbs, and then quickly to the rest of the country. So in the city center is where you have the big financial companies, the big enterprises, but in the suburbs, you have the poor areas with no companies. So the protests expanded to the suburbs, to the outskirts of the cities, and then to little cities, and then to every single village in the country. And now, very quickly, the army came out. Now, our president ordered the military to come out on the streets. This man is a billionaire who owns many service companies. And now, this was the most massive and violent protest ever since, of course, the dictatorship. And a lot of people are trying to hide this fact. Now, this image you see here is not on the book, but it's interesting because in yellow and blue, you can see how many workplace strikes took place. You see, every year, 300 strikes were taking place in different workplaces. And in blue, you see the legal strikes, and the yellow ones, the non-legal strikes. Remember that in Chile, the right to strike is very limited. On the right-hand side, you can see general strikes and regional strikes. So you see, from 2010, when there were the first student protests, we see in some regions out of the capital, outside of Santiago, social outbreaks, micro general strikes in several regions. And then you see 2019. The year 2019 begins with a feminist strike, a very big feminist strike. And when this outbreak takes place, there is a lot of calling to organize general strikes. By the way, there have been many films and documentaries. This is People on Strike, showing how this social uprising took place. Why do I call it social outbreak and popular revolt or uprising? Well, social outbreak speaks about the first few days when citizens were expressing their rage. But in order to maintain this sort of uprising, you need to create a revolt, a popular revolt, revolution or uprising. So that there needs to be an organizing actor. Now, which was the role of unionisms, of trade unions? The strongest trade unions in the last decade began taking on the managing of the movement. I'm talking about miners, teachers, metal workers, builders, but also service workers who were renewing their union movements, especially commerce workers and financial or bank workers. This is interesting, and it's worth studying specifically how the ruling of the movement, how there was a dispute really about who would rule the movement, who would run the uprising. There was the CUT, Unitary Central of Workers, Central Unitaria de Trabajadores. There was the the Socialist Party. And then the 12th of November begins the general strike. So on the 12th of November, a general strike takes place, but it's organized mainly by non-organized workers. And this takes place in the outskirts of the city, in the poor areas, and in every city in the country. This has an unprecedented impact, because this had never happened in Chile. And this triggered a strong opposition to political parties. We're sorry, Domingo, we need to conclude. Yes, no worries, I will conclude. So, in order to conclude, I would like to show you how important this general strike was. Imagine 70 actions, protest actions per day, 74. But then, this was at the beginning of the uprising. But see, on the 12th of November, in one single day, 301 actions took place. And this changed the nature of the movement. There was a social and political impact. A lot of political prisoners are still in jail, and this is triggering a debate that will conclude in March. But the important thing is that the most important event, actually, this enormous outbreak triggered a union between social movements and unions, trade unions. A lot of people became politicized due to this conflict. And the cycle of strikes that we were seeing already in Chile increased the number of affiliates in trade unions. And you have to think, who was protesting? Not only workers, all the working class, all the working families, even children, the whole proletariat was participating in this general strike. And there's something paradoxical. It began, this movement, with a lot of rage, a lot of protest. Then it ended up with a constitutional plebiscite, but it also showed the how precarious the working class is. It had very dramatic effects and impacts in the people. It was also important for unionism, the social power. This general strike wouldn't have been able to be organized if it hadn't been for the support of the social movements. And it's very interesting as a case study to look at strategic position. In poor areas, in the outskirts of the cities, there could be a lot of development because there is a lot of social support.
Unfortunately, our time is limited, but we see there's a lot to talk about. So you're all invited to continue the discussion, to invite maybe authors or contact us. We will be happy to facilitate the contact with any of the authors if you're interested in organizing debates. I think that this presentation by Domingo was also very important because it also again showed and resumed many of the aspects we were talking about in the beginning. So what is working class? It's not just the ones in the factories. It's everyone. It's the whole neighborhood. It's the family. It's like the other ones, the marginalized, the precarious workers, the non-unionized workers, etc. What is the protest? It's not just strike. It has like parts of uprising, of like etc. And obviously, very important, the lesson by already Rosa Luxemburg, who gave her name to, or the foundation took the name, let's say that way. But like it is the action that creates organization, not the other way around. It's the action that creates unity and organization. It's not that you start with that and then you pass to action, but it's like in these, and everyone whoever participated and had political activism knows that whenever there are things moving, people are more open to listen to others, to get together with others, and to experience in the struggle who their allies are. So it's not even like such a weird thing. It might only be weird if you don't participate in struggles. Okay. There are like still many questions. Maybe one very brief for Domingo, because it's one that has been burning under the needs of everyone, obviously. What is your take on the new government, on the new presidency and the new government? How many hopes or not, and how cautious or not, how socialist or not will it be? Very brief, please.
El presidente electo,
the elected president played a very particular role during the uprisal. After the general strike, he helped to develop a peace agreement, which hasn't existed. Because remember that the president, the former president, wasn't persecuted even if there were human rights violations. So he paved the way with the Constituent Assembly. So a lot of people were against the former president. He had terrible reactions against the political prisoners, and he even had with him progressive groups, left-wing groups. So from December on, there was a void, a political gap in Chile. And in Chile, we see a lot of anti-communism forces. You have to understand that the Communist Party in Chile is pretty strong compared to other countries' communist parties. So there were disputes between Gabriel Boric and members of the Communist Party. And most of the population gave their support to Gabriel Boric, but he has a very difficult situation. He doesn't have political forces really supporting him. Yes, of course, a bit of support, but a lot of them very critical with Gabriel. He hasn't been able to approve a new constitution, so he cannot make structural changes. And as Marx would said, history repeats itself. I do think that we've all done it worse. We are being weaker, all the revolutions and the progressists as well, and the revolutionaries.
Evaluation. And so again, I'm sorry we could not respond to more questions. We have many. I also wanted to talk a bit because I contributed a chapter on like the class struggle during the pandemic, which touches also the question, are we reverting the situation of decreasing workers' power and class power? And I think yes, not at the height that will that it will be in favor of the working class or labor confronted to capital, but I think that we have reached a historical turning point, like during the pandemic, which became visible during the pandemic. Okay, thank you very much to everyone. Again, also to several of the listeners. Thank you very much for the interpreters. I think it was probably a very tough job they did. Thank you again to Jan, and I just pass on to Jan now. Thanks.
Yeah, no, thank you, Dario. I mean, for us, it was a very special event. And I mean, for those of us who live in Central European time, we will now forever know what we did exactly at 2 o'clock on the 2nd of February, 2022. There will never be more tooth in a date or an appointment than this one. So thanks again for this very fascinating presentation, the diverse perspectives. And obviously, I also would like to extend my special gratitude to everyone who made this possible, especially our team here at the office, Jan and Seva, and our fantastic interpreters who guided us through this day. But most of all, I would like to thank you, the listeners, the attendees, those who came to spend these 1.5 hours of, just very diverse perspectives. And I hope you follow with us. I would like to point you to our website, rosalux.geneva.org, so that you can actually follow our work. And yes, I just see the message. The recording will be made available on our website soon, so you have an opportunity to look at it again. And for any questions, just also mail us directly and we'll forward this. The book, again, can be downloaded in English and in German, and free as a PDF. And we're just looking forward to see many of you again in different formats, in different settings, on different topics. And with this, I would like to thank you and say goodbye from Geneva, and have a wonderful day, evening, or morning, wherever you are. Goodbye. Ciao.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.